In 1867, in a small apartment in Vevey, Switzerland, a young mother sat helpless beside her dying infant child. The baby was premature and too weak to feed, and the mother had no milk to give. The local doctor had already given up hope and told the family to prepare for the worst. But then a neighbor knocked on the door and handed them a small glass bottle filled with a pale white mixture that nobody had ever seen before. Within days, the baby began to recover. Within weeks, the child was healthy. The neighbor who brought that bottle was not a doctor. He was not a scientist. He was the son of a poor baker from Frankfurt, Germany, and his name was Henri Nestlé. Fast forward to today, and the company that bears his name is the largest food and beverage corporation on the planet, generating over $90 billion in annual revenue selling products in nearly every country on Earth. This is the story of how one baker's son, armed with nothing but curiosity and compassion, changed the way the entire world eats. The story begins on August 10, 1814, in Frankfurt, Germany, where Johann Ulrich Nestlé and his wife, Anna Maria, welcomed their 9th child into the world. They named him Heinrich Nestlé, though he would later go by the French version of his name, Henri. Johann was a glazier by trade, meaning he repaired and fitted glass windows for a living. It was modest work that paid modest wages, and with a household of 11 children feeding the family was no small task. Growing up in such a crowded and financially stretched home, Henri learned early on what it meant to go without. He watched his mother stretch every meal as far as it could go, and he grew up understanding that food was not something to be taken for granted. Frankfurt at the time was a bustling commercial city, and Henri was an observant and curious child who soaked in everything around him. But tragedy struck the family early. Of the 14 children born to the Nestlé family, only 8 survived into adulthood. The loss of siblings due to illness, malnutrition, and disease was a wound that Henri carried quietly for the rest of his life, and one that would eventually shape the entire direction of his career. When Henri was a teenager, his father passed away, leaving the family in an even more precarious financial position. With limited options and a restless spirit, Henri made the decision that many ambitious young Europeans of his era made. He would leave home and seek his fortune elsewhere. At the age of 21, Henri packed what little he had and moved to Vevey, a small picturesque town nestled on the banks of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. He had no connections there, no family, no guarantee of work. He arrived as a stranger in a foreign place with little more than his determination to build something for himself. In Vevey, Henri found work as an apprentice to a local pharmacist and merchant named Marc Nicolier. This was a pivotal moment in his life. Working under Nicolier, Henri was introduced to the world of chemistry experimentation and the science of food and medicine. He spent years learning how different substances interacted with each other, how certain compounds could be used to treat illness, and how raw ingredients could be transformed into something entirely new. It was slow, methodical work that required patience and precision. 2 qualities Henri had developed through years of watching his mother manage a household with almost nothing. But Henri was never content to simply follow instructions. He was the kind of man who asked why. Why did certain food preparations preserve better than others? Why did infants in the region suffer such alarming rates of malnutrition? Why were mothers who could not breastfeed left with almost no alternatives? These questions gnawed at him for years. And while he was still working for Nicolier, Henri began conducting his own private experiments on the side using a small workshop he had set up in his home. By his mid-30s, Henri had established himself as a legitimate figure in the Vevey business community. He had taken over a small business of his own, producing and selling various chemical products, including fertilizers, rum, and liqueurs. He was not wealthy by any measure, but he was resourceful, and he had built a reputation as a man who could figure things out. Still, none of these ventures lit a fire inside him. He was searching for a problem worth solving, and he had not yet found it. That problem found him in the form of a crisis. In the mid-19th century, infant mortality across Europe was staggeringly high. Babies born prematurely, or to mothers who were unable to produce sufficient milk, had almost no chance of survival. The alternatives available to these families were grim. Animal milk was often contaminated and difficult for newborn digestive systems to process. Sugar water and grain broths were nutritionally inadequate. Wet nurses were expensive and inaccessible to poor families, and so babies died, thousands of them, every year, in every country across the continent. Henri had watched his own siblings perish as a child. He had seen the same pattern repeat itself among the families of Vevey throughout his adult life, and he could not accept that nothing could be done. He began throwing himself into the problem with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He read everything he could find on infant nutrition. He consulted with local doctors and physicians. He experimented relentlessly in his workshop, combining cow's milk with wheat flour and sugar in various concentrations, trying to find a formula that a fragile newborn stomach could actually tolerate and absorb. The process took years. Most attempts failed. Some produced mixtures that curdled or spoiled too quickly. Others were nutritionally incomplete. Henri pressed on. He was meticulous in his record-keeping, adjusting measurements and preparation methods after each failure. He was not a formally trained scientist, but he approached his work with the discipline of one. And slowly, through a painstaking process of trial and error, he began to get closer. By 1867, Henri believed he had finally created something that worked. He called his invention Farine Lactée, which translates from French as milk flour. It was a combination of cow's milk sugar and cooked cereal that had been carefully processed to make it digestible for infants. The mixture could be dissolved in warm water and fed to a baby through a bottle. It was simple, it was affordable, and Henri believed it could save lives. He did not have to wait long to find out. Shortly after completing his formula, Henri learned of a desperate situation just a short distance from his home. A premature infant boy in the neighborhood was failing rapidly. The child's mother was unable to breastfeed, and every other feeding method the doctor had tried had been rejected by the infant's fragile system. The doctor had privately told the family the child would not survive. Henri went to the family with his mixture and convinced them to try it. They had nothing to lose. The baby accepted the formula, and then he kept accepting it. Day after day, the child fed and grew stronger. Within 2 weeks, the infant who had been given up for dead was visibly recovering. Within a month, he was thriving. The doctor who had predicted the child's death was stunned. Word spread quickly through Vevey and then beyond it. Henri Nestlé had created something extraordinary. Demand for Farine Lactée spread faster than Henri had anticipated. Letters began arriving from doctors and mothers across Switzerland, asking where they could obtain the product. Henri scaled up his small operation as quickly as he could, working out of his Vevey workshop to meet the growing orders. He was meticulous about quality, refusing to cut corners, even as demand overwhelmed his small production capacity. Every batch was checked. Every shipment was personally overseen. Within a year, Farine Lactée had spread beyond Switzerland into France, Germany, and England. Medical journals began publishing favorable reports about the product, and the European medical community started recommending it as the safest available alternative to mother's milk. Henri was not a natural businessman in the traditional sense. He was not aggressive or ruthless. He was methodical and principled, and he built his reputation on the trust of the doctors and mothers who depended on his product. By the early 1870s, Henri Nestlé's company had grown from a one-man workshop operation into a small but rapidly expanding business with distribution across multiple European countries. He had hired staff to help with production and a small team to manage orders and correspondence. The company bore his name, and his personal guarantee of quality was its most important asset. Henri was fiercely protective of that guarantee. He turned down opportunities to expand faster when he felt quality could not be maintained. He refused to license his formula to other manufacturers who approached him wanting to produce cheaper versions. His name was on the product, and he intended it to mean something. But success brought new problems. As Nestlé's reputation grew, so did the attention of competitors and opportunists. Several companies began producing imitation products that mimicked Farine Lactée in name and appearance, but lacked its nutritional quality. Mothers who purchased these counterfeits and saw poor results sometimes blamed Henri's product rather than the imitations. It was a frustrating battle that Henri fought primarily through his relationships with the medical community, who continued to distinguish genuine Nestlé product from the fakes. Then came a more serious threat from within. In 1874, a group of investors who had acquired shares in Henri's company began pushing aggressively to take control of the business. Henri had taken on outside capital in order to fund his expansion across Europe, and those investors now believed the company had grown too large to remain under the personal management of one man. They argued that Henri's cautious approach to growth was holding the company back, and that a more aggressive commercial strategy was needed. The boardroom battles that followed were bitter. Henri was a man of principle, not politics, and he found the corporate maneuvering deeply distasteful. Faced with the prospect of watching his life's work transformed into something he no longer recognized, Henri made a decision that surprised nearly everyone who knew him. In 1875, at the age of 61, Henri Nestlé sold his company. He sold the formula, the trademark, the factory, and the Nestlé name to 3 local businessmen for 1 million Swiss francs. He walked away from Vevey shortly after and retired to Glion, a small mountain village overlooking Lake Geneva, where he lived quietly until his death in 1890. Many people who heard about the sale assumed Henri had made a mistake. They believed he had given away something worth far more than he received. But Henri saw it differently. He had set out to solve a problem, and he had solved it. The product existed. It was saving lives. And he was 61 years old with no children to inherit his work and no desire to spend his remaining years fighting shareholders in a boardroom. He left on his own terms, and he left with his integrity intact. The men who purchased Nestlé's company wasted no time in expanding it. Under new management, the company merged in 1905 with the Anglo-Swiss Condensed Milk Company, a rival that had actually been founded by 2 American brothers in Cham, Switzerland. The merged entity was renamed the Nestlé and Anglo-Swiss Condensed Milk Company, and it immediately became one of the most powerful food businesses in Europe. The new leadership had the commercial aggression that Henri had resisted, and they used it to push the brand into new markets with remarkable speed. The First World War created enormous demand for condensed and powdered food products that could be produced in large quantities, stored for long periods, and transported to troops in the field. Nestlé's factories ran at full capacity throughout the war, and by the time the conflict ended in 1918, the company had nearly doubled its number of factories worldwide. The brand that began in a small workshop in Vevey was now a global industrial operation. The decades that followed brought a series of product breakthroughs that would each on their own have been enough to define a company's legacy. In 1938, Nestlé introduced Nescafé, the world's first commercially successful instant coffee. The product was developed in response to a request from the Brazilian government, which was sitting on a massive surplus of coffee beans and needed a way to preserve and sell them. Nestlé's chemists spent 7 years developing the formula, and when Nescafé finally launched it became one of the fastest-selling new food products in history. During World War II, American soldiers were supplied with Nescafé as part of their standard rations, spreading the product to every corner of the globe where American forces were deployed. The company continued its expansion through the second half of the 20th century, not only through product development, but through acquisition. Nestlé purchased Maggi in 1947, adding a vast range of seasoning soups and culinary products to its portfolio. It acquired Stouffer's in 1973, entering the frozen food market. It purchased Carnation in 1985 in what was at the time one of the largest acquisitions in the history of the food industry. It bought Rowntree's in 1988, gaining ownership of Kit Kat Smarties and Quality Street. And it acquired Purina in 2001, making it one of the world's largest pet food manufacturers as well. Each acquisition was a calculated move to diversify and dominate. By the end of the 20th century, Nestlé was not simply a food company. It was a vast, interconnected empire of brands that touched virtually every category of human nutrition, from the first meal of a newborn infant to the last cup of coffee at the end of a long day. Today, Nestlé employs over 270,000 people across more than 180 countries. Its product portfolio includes over 2,000 brands, ranging from Nespresso and Kit Kat to Gerber and Purina. The company that Henri Nestlé built from a small glass bottle of infant formula in 1867 generates more revenue annually than the entire GDP of many nations. It is by nearly every measure the largest food and beverage company in the history of human civilization. And it all began because a baker's son from Frankfurt could not stop thinking about why babies were dying. Henri Nestlé never sought fame. He never positioned himself as a visionary or a titan of industry. He was a quiet, methodical man who identified a problem that others had accepted as inevitable and refused to accept it himself. He worked in obscurity for decades. He failed repeatedly. He sold his company before it became truly great and walked away to a quiet mountain village while others built his name into an empire. But his formula lived on. His name lived on. And the hundreds of millions of infants who have been nourished by products that trace their origin back to that small workshop in Vevey, Switzerland, are the truest measure of what one baker's son was able to accomplish. Looking back on everything he built, Henri Nestlé once said simply that his greatest wish was that his product would reach every mother who needed it. By any measure, it has. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to subscribe and like the video. Until then, I'll see you in the next one.